Every morning, without exception, they lined up with razors in frozen hands, while artillery screamed overhead, and men died less than 300 meters away. The ritual seemed absurd, almost insulting, given what waited for them in the ruins ahead. But Sergeant Klaus Weber watched them with the intensity of a man who had seen something the others had not yet witnessed, something that transformed a simple grooming regulation into a prayer whispered against the possibility of drowning in open air while your lungs turned to liquid fire inside your chest. The Eastern Front in late 1943 had become a landscape of contradictions that defied every assumption the Wehrmacht had carried into the Soviet Union 2 years earlier, when the invasion began with the confidence of men who believed they would celebrate Christmas in Moscow before the first snow fell. Sergeant Klaus Weber commanded a reinforced infantry platoon within the 2nd Battalion of the 76th Infantry Division, positioned in the industrial suburbs southwest of Stalingrad, where factories had been converted into fortresses through months of brutal close-quarters combat that reduced city blocks to abstract collections of rubble and frozen corpses. The German Army Group South, which had confidently advanced across the southern steppes during the summer of 1942, expecting to crush Soviet resistance through the application of superior tactics and firepower, now fought desperately to maintain defensive positions against relentless Soviet counterattacks that employed tactics learned through 2 years of catastrophic defeats and adapted with a ruthlessness that matched the terrible price both sides paid for every meter of contested ground. Weber had joined the Wehrmacht in 1938, serving first in Poland, where the campaign lasted weeks rather than months, and created the illusion that modern mechanized warfare had solved the stalemate problems that had characterized the previous war. Then in France, where the speed of the German advance seemed to validate every assumption about armored breakthrough and coordinated air-ground operations. He had expected Russia to follow the same pattern of rapid advance and enemy collapse, but the Soviet Union proved to be something fundamentally different from anything the German military had encountered in Western Europe, a vast space that absorbed German spearheads the way an ocean absorbs stones thrown from the shore, while grinding down men and equipment through a combination of distance, weather, and an enemy willing to accept casualties that would have broken any Western army within weeks of sustained combat. Weber carried memories of the first winter, when temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and German soldiers froze to death in positions they could not abandon because retreat meant exposure to Soviet ski troops who moved through the forest like ghosts made of snow and murder, along with memories of summer advances where his unit marched 20 kilometers daily through clouds of dust that turned sweat into a coating of mud, while Soviet armies simply withdrew deeper into territory. That seemed to have no end and no center where a decisive blow might land. The mission briefing 3 days earlier had outlined objectives that sounded straightforward on paper, but carried implications that every veteran in the room understood without needing to hear them spoken aloud. Weber's platoon would occupy a section of the defense line running through the skeletal remains of the Red October factory, maintaining observation posts that monitored Soviet activity across a no-man's land of collapsed walls and frozen shell craters while preparing fallback positions in case the current line became untenable under sustained assault. Intelligence reports indicated increased Soviet chemical weapons stockpiles in forward areas following the capture of German documents that detailed Wehrmacht gas warfare capabilities and doctrine, though military command dismissed these reports as exaggerated because both sides had avoided large-scale gas attacks throughout the war, despite maintaining substantial arsenals left over from the previous conflict. The briefing officer, a captain who had transferred from a staff position in Berlin, and still spoke with the confident certainty of someone who had never breathed air thick with brick dust and explosive residue, assured them that standard defensive procedures would be sufficient and that gas masks should be carried as a precautionary measure rather than immediate necessity. Weber positioned his men in the pre-dawn darkness, moving through frozen rubble, while Soviet flares rose periodically to illuminate a landscape that looked more like the surface of an alien planet than anything that had once contained human habitation and industry. The temperature had dropped to -32 degrees Celsius overnight, cold enough that exposed skin froze within minutes, and breathing required careful attention to avoid damaging lung tissue with rapid inhalation of air that felt sharp enough to cut from the inside. His soldiers moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned to function in conditions that would have killed them during their first weeks at the front, carrying weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent metal from freezing to bare skin while stepping carefully through debris fields, where a single misstep could break an ankle or trigger a booby trap left behind during previous fighting. Soviet artillery began its morning harassment fire right on schedule, shells impacting randomly across the German positions in a pattern designed more to prevent rest than inflict casualties. The explosions sending up fountains of frozen earth and twisted metal that fell back to ground with sounds like breaking glass. The Soviet probe came 2 hours after sunrise, not a full assault, but a reconnaissance in force designed to test German response times and identify weak points in the defense line. Weber counted approximately 40 infantry moving through the rubble 300 meters to his front, advancing in small groups that used cover effectively, while maintaining loose coordination across a 200-meter frontage that suggested this was a company-level operation rather than a spontaneous patrol. His machine gunners opened fire first, their weapons chattering in short controlled bursts that forced the Soviet troops to ground, while mortar teams in the rear positions calculated firing solutions based on pre-registered markers that had been established during the previous week. The engagement lasted 17 minutes before the Soviets withdrew, leaving behind 4 bodies that would remain frozen in position until spring thaw made their recovery possible, along with blood trails in the snow that marked where wounded had been dragged back toward their own lines. Weber was inspecting the forward positions when the shells began landing differently. Wrong sound, wrong smell. Yellow-green mist spreading low across the frozen ground instead of dissipating upward. Chemical weapons, gas masks on now, men scrambling for equipment, some faces already showing the first signs of exposure, skin blistering, eyes streaming, 3 soldiers clawing at masks that would not seal properly, beards breaking the rubber seal, air leaking in around facial hair they had not shaved that morning, panic spreading faster than the gas cloud. Weber realized with horrible clarity that the regulation everyone mocked was about to sort his platoon into 2 groups, those who would live and those who would drown in their own dissolving lung tissue while their comrades watched helplessly through fogged mask lenses. The gas cloud moved with the deliberate patience of something that understood it could not be outrun or fought with conventional weapons, rolling across the frozen ground in waves that found every depression and filled every shell crater with yellow-green death that turned the morning air into something thick enough to see and smell, even through the activated charcoal filters of properly sealed masks. Weber had encountered chlorine gas once before during training exercises, where instructors exposed recruits to controlled concentrations inside sealed chambers to teach them the absolute necessity of immediate mask deployment and proper seal verification. But training chambers with medical personnel standing ready with atropine injections bore no resemblance to this moment, where the nearest aid station was 2 kilometers behind the lines and the Soviet artillery continued to fall in patterns, designed to prevent evacuation or reinforcement. The chemical weapons manual that every platoon leader carried specified that chlorine gas caused immediate respiratory distress, followed by fluid accumulation in the lungs that essentially drowned victims in their own bodily secretions, a process that could take anywhere from 2 minutes to 2 hours, depending on concentration and duration of exposure, with heavier-than-air properties that made basements and trenches into death traps, where gas pooled in concentrations high enough to kill within seconds. Private Ernst Hoffmann died first, a 20-year-old conscript from Bavaria who had joined the unit 6 weeks earlier, still carrying the softness of someone who had grown up in a village where the war existed primarily through radio broadcasts and rationing notices, rather than as an immediate physical reality that could be touched and smelled. Hoffmann had been complaining about the shaving regulations since his arrival, arguing that maintaining a clean face in sub-zero temperatures with limited water and dull razor blades constituted unnecessary cruelty when they faced genuine threats that made grooming standards seem absurdly trivial by comparison, and Weber had issued 3 formal warnings about the stubble that appeared on Hoffman's face each morning before the mandatory inspection. The young soldier had managed to get his mask on within the required 5 seconds, after the first warning shouts echoed through the position, but the 3-day growth of beard that covered his jaw and upper neck prevented the rubber seal from making complete contact with his skin, creating tiny gaps that allowed gas-contaminated air to seep inward with each desperate breath. Weber watched from 10 meters away, as Hoffman realized his mask was not protecting him, saw the exact moment when the private understood that he was breathing poison and that nothing could be done to save him now that the gas had entered his respiratory system and begun its irreversible chemical reaction with the moisture in his lungs. Weber had seen men die in dozens of ways across 4 years of war that had taken him from the Polish plains to the French coast, and finally into the vast killing grounds of the Eastern Front, where death arrived through bullets, artillery fragments, freezing temperatures, disease, starvation, and the simple exhaustion that came from fighting an enemy that seemed to possess infinite reserves of men and material. But watching Hoffman die from gas exposure, while wearing a mask that should have saved him, created a particular species of horror that transcended normal combat casualties, because the young soldier remained fully conscious throughout the entire process of suffocation and understood with terrible clarity that he was drowning in fluid that his own damaged lungs were producing in response to the chemical burns spreading through his respiratory tissue. Hoffman tried to speak, but managed only wet choking sounds that grew progressively worse as pink foam began seeping around the edges of his mask, the froth indicating that his lungs had started dissolving and mixing blood with the fluid that filled spaces meant for air. The private clawed at his throat in the universal gesture of suffocation, his movements becoming more frantic as oxygen deprivation combined with panic to produce a final minute of thrashing that ended when his body simply stopped responding to commands from a brain that was shutting down from lack of oxygen. The gas attack lasted approximately 12 minutes from first impact to final dissipation, though Weber would remember it as much longer, because time distorted in situations where every second carried the possibility of death from an invisible threat that could only be detected after it had already begun killing. 3 more soldiers died during those 12 minutes, all of them men who had ignored or inadequately followed the shaving regulation and whose masks failed to seal properly when the chlorine cloud rolled over their positions. Weber moved through the contaminated area, helping soldiers whose masks had sealed correctly, checking seals and ensuring that panicked men did not tear off their protection in the mistaken belief that the masks themselves were suffocating them rather than saving their lives. 2 soldiers suffered partial exposure that would require immediate medical evacuation and likely result in permanent lung damage even if they survived, their breathing already showing the wet rattling sound that indicated fluid accumulation. Soviet infantry attacked during the final minutes of the gas cloud's presence, advancing behind the chemical weapons barrage in an assault timed to exploit the chaos and confusion that gas attacks inevitably created among defending forces. Weber's surviving soldiers engaged the attackers with weapons that felt clumsy and difficult to aim, while wearing masks that restricted vision and made verbal communication nearly impossible beyond shouted single-word commands. The firefight lasted longer than the gas attack itself, close-quarters combat in rubble fields where soldiers appeared suddenly from behind collapsed walls and disappeared just as quickly into smoke and chemical haze that had not yet fully cleared. When silence finally returned, Weber counted casualties: 4 dead from gas exposure, 2 critically wounded, 3 with minor injuries from the infantry assault. 11 of his original 32-man platoon remained fully combat effective. All survivors had been clean-shaven that morning. Every casualty from gas exposure had been a soldier with stubble or beard growth that prevented proper mask seal. The correlation was absolute, perfect, undeniable. Weber understood in that moment that the regulation everyone mocked had just divided his platoon into the living and the dead, based purely on whether they had dragged a razor across their face in the pre-dawn darkness. The rule was not arbitrary. It was prophecy written in military bureaucracy, and he had failed to enforce it strictly enough. 4 men dead because he had issued warnings instead of consequences. The bodies remained in their positions for 3 hours after the attack ended, because Soviet snipers controlled the approaches to the contaminated area, and German command refused to authorize a recovery operation until reconnaissance confirmed that secondary gas pockets had fully dissipated from the lower-lying sections of the rubble field. Weber sat in the platoon command post, a reinforced basement beneath what had once been a factory administrative building, writing casualty reports that reduced Private Hoffman and 3 other soldiers to lines of text documenting time of death, cause of death, and location of remains for eventual collection by graves registration units that operated behind the front lines. The reports required him to specify whether proper protective equipment had been available and whether soldiers had followed established chemical warfare protocols, questions that forced Weber to document his own failure to enforce regulations that everyone in the unit had treated as pointless bureaucratic harassment, until poison gas transformed grooming standards into a life-or-death sorting mechanism. He wrote that all deceased soldiers had been equipped with functional gas masks, but that improper facial hair had prevented adequate seal formation, a statement that would certainly generate questions from battalion headquarters about why a platoon leader had allowed multiple soldiers to violate regulations specifically designed to ensure gas mask effectiveness. Weber had commanded men in combat for 3 years and understood that military discipline existed on a spectrum that ranged from the iron rigidity of parade ground formations to the practical flexibility required in combat situations where survival often depended on individual initiative and the ability to adapt standing orders to unexpected circumstances. The Eastern Front had taught him that officers who insisted on garrison standards in combat environments quickly lost the respect and trust of experienced soldiers who recognized the difference between regulations that served genuine tactical purposes and those that existed primarily to maintain abstract principles of military order and hierarchy. He had learned to distinguish between rules that could be bent without consequence and those that absolutely required enforcement, regardless of how soldiers perceived them, though he had clearly miscalculated regarding the shaving regulation by treating it as a standard issue rather than a critical survival requirement. The gas attack had eliminated any ambiguity about which category applied to facial hair standards, but Weber now faced the challenge of convincing 19 surviving soldiers that a rule they had spent months mocking and circumventing had suddenly become the single most important regulation in the entire Wehrmacht operational manual, more critical than ammunition discipline or position security, because those other rules affected tactical success, while this one determined whether you lived or died. When the yellow-green clouds came rolling across frozen ground, the transformation in Weber's enforcement approach began immediately after the casualty reports were filed and the dead had been carried away to the collection point where frozen corpses accumulated, until graves registration units could transport them to temporary burial sites behind the lines. He assembled the entire platoon in the command post basement, 19 men who had survived because they had either been clean-shaven or lucky enough to be positioned outside the primary gas concentration zone, and explained in language stripped of any ambiguity or diplomatic softening that effective immediately every soldier would shave every morning without exception, regardless of temperature, water availability, or tactical situation. The regulation would be enforced through direct observation during morning inspection, and any soldier found with visible facial hair would face immediate charges that could result in court-martial and execution for violating chemical warfare preparedness protocols during active operations. Weber made it clear that he was not requesting cooperation or seeking voluntary compliance, but rather issuing a direct order backed by the full authority of military law and his personal commitment to shoot any soldier who chose to ignore a regulation that had already killed 4 men through their own negligence, and his failure to prevent that negligence from becoming fatal. Resistance emerged within 48 hours. Not open defiance, but passive resistance, expressed through deliberate incompleteness in shaving and muttered complaints about priorities in a combat zone where soldiers faced dozens of ways to die, and where focusing obsessively on facial hair seemed to indicate that leadership had lost perspective on what actually mattered. Corporal Dieter Mann, a veteran who had fought since Poland, and whose scarred face testified to multiple wounds that had not killed him despite coming very close, argued that Weber was overreacting to a single gas attack and that the Soviets had limited chemical weapons capabilities that made large-scale gas warfare unlikely, despite this one incident. Mann pointed out that in 4 years of war neither side had employed chemical weapons extensively, despite maintaining substantial stockpiles, suggesting that the attack they had experienced was an aberration rather than the beginning of a new phase in the conflict that would require constant readiness for gas attacks. Weber listened to Mann's objections in silence, then ordered the corporal to accompany him to the collection point where bodies awaited transport. They walked through morning cold that turned breath into clouds of ice crystals, while artillery rumbled in the distance, like approaching thunder that never quite arrived. The collection point occupied a shell crater that served as temporary storage for casualties that had accumulated across the battalion sector over the previous 72 hours, bodies frozen into whatever positions they had occupied at the moment of death and stacked like cordwood along the crater's edge. Weber made Mann look at Hoffmann's body. The private's face had frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Eyes bulged from oxygen starvation, pink foam crystallized around his mouth and nose where it had leaked from destroyed lungs. "You think this is overreaction?" Weber asked. 4 men suffocated while wearing equipment designed to save them. Because of facial hair. Because I did not enforce the regulation. Mann stared at the corpse in silence. "When the next gas attack comes," Weber continued, "your beard will kill you exactly the same way. No exceptions, no second chances. Shave or face charges. Those are your only options now." The morning inspection on February 14, 1944, occurred under conditions that would have seemed impossible to soldiers who had experienced only Western European campaigns where supply lines functioned and basic necessities arrived with reasonable regularity. Weber's platoon had been reinforced back to 28 men through the arrival of replacements pulled from rear area units and convalescent soldiers returning from field hospitals, creating a mix of veterans who had survived the first gas attack and newcomers who had heard about the incident through the informal communication networks that spread information faster than official channels. The temperature had dropped to -38 degrees Celsius overnight, cold enough that the limited water available for washing had frozen solid despite being stored inside heated spaces, forcing soldiers to melt snow over candles and gasoline-soaked rags to generate enough liquid for the mandatory shaving that Weber now enforced with absolute rigidity. Every soldier stood in formation, while Weber personally inspected each face, running his fingers across jaws and necks to detect even the slightest stubble that might compromise mask seal integrity. And 3 men were immediately removed from the duty roster and confined to the command post facing charges that could result in execution for violating chemical warfare preparedness protocols. The new replacement struggled to understand why a sergeant would threaten death for facial hair, while Soviet artillery landed randomly across their positions and enemy infantry probed their lines daily, searching for weaknesses that could be exploited during larger assaults. Weber had learned that explaining his reasoning was less effective than demonstrating consequences, so he had arranged for all new arrivals to visit the battalion collection point, where bodies from the first gas attack remained frozen in storage, awaiting spring weather that would make burial possible in ground currently too hard to excavate. The visit served its intended purpose of converting skeptics into believers, though several soldiers continued to resist through passive non-compliance that manifested as incomplete shaving or claims that dull razors and frozen water made proper grooming physically impossible under current conditions. Weber responded by personally distributing razor blades from his own supply and demonstrating that adequate shaving could be accomplished using melted snow and hand soap, eliminating every excuse and forcing soldiers to either comply fully or face formal charges that would be adjudicated by courts-martial tribunals that showed no mercy toward violations of regulations during combat operations. Corporal Mann had become Weber's most effective advocate for the shaving regulation after witnessing Hoffmann's frozen corpse, using his status as a decorated veteran to counter skepticism among soldiers who might have dismissed Weber's enforcement as the obsession of an officer who had lost perspective under the stress of prolonged combat exposure. Mann spoke bluntly about what gas exposure actually meant in practical terms. describing in clinical detail how chlorine reacted with lung tissue to produce hydrochloric acid that essentially cooked respiratory organs from the inside, while victims remained conscious and aware throughout the process of drowning in their own bodily fluids. The corporal's willingness to describe these horrors in graphic detail proved more persuasive than any official order or threat of punishment, creating a culture within the platoon where proper shaving became a shared survival ritual rather than an imposed burden. Though 3 soldiers continued to resist through various forms of non-compliance that Weber documented carefully in preparation for the courts-martial that would follow once the tactical situation permitted formal proceedings. The second gas attack arrived without warning on February 19th at 0400 hours. Chemical weapons shells landing in concentrated patterns that suggested Soviet artillery had improved their delivery accuracy and increased the scale of their chemical warfare capabilities since the first attack 3 weeks earlier. Weber's platoon occupied positions deeper in the factory complex, where multiple basement levels provided natural protection against conventional artillery, but also created exactly the kind of low-lying confined spaces where heavier-than-air gases would pool in fatal concentrations. The attack began with what sounded like normal high-explosive shells, but transitioned within seconds to the distinctive muffled impacts that indicated chemical weapons deployment, giving soldiers approximately 3 to 5 seconds to recognize the threat and deploy their masks before gas concentrations reached immediately lethal levels in the basement spaces where the platoon had established defensive positions. Weber got his mask on in under 3 seconds, the movement so automatic after weeks of obsessive drilling that his hands completed the process before his conscious mind fully registered what was happening. Around him, soldiers scrambled for equipment in darkness, broken only by brief flashes from explosions above ground that sent shockwaves through the basement structure, hard enough to shake loose dust and debris from damaged ceilings. The familiar yellow-green mist began seeping down stairwells and through ventilation gaps, moving with that same deliberate patience that Weber remembered from the first attack, spreading across the floor like liquid death that rose slowly upward to fill the entire space. Private Klaus Richter died within 90 seconds. The replacement had argued for 3 days that Weber's enforcement was excessive, had shaved carelessly that morning, left stubble along his neck. Now he clawed at a mask that leaked poison with every breath. Weber watched through fogged lenses as Richter's movements became frantic, then weak, then stopped completely. The gas filled the basement in under 4 minutes. 25 soldiers breathed filtered air through masks that sealed perfectly against clean-shaven faces. 3 soldiers suffocated in full view of comrades who could do nothing except watch and breathe and survive. Every death occurred the same way. Masks on within seconds. Proper equipment. Fatal gaps where facial hair prevented seal. The same pink foam, the same thrashing, the same horrible understanding in their eyes that they were dying from their own choice to ignore a regulation that had tried to save them. When Soviet infantry attacked behind the gas barrage, Weber's surviving soldiers fought with the cold efficiency of men who had just watched the universe demonstrate that some rules existed for reasons that transcended military discipline or bureaucratic control. They held their positions through 2 hours of close combat in spaces still contaminated with gas residue, no casualties from chemical exposure among those who had shaved properly. 100% mortality for those who had not. Weber stood among the survivors at dawn. 25 men who had dragged razors across frozen faces that morning, 3 bodies being carried to the collection point. The arithmetic was absolute, undeniable. A stupid regulation about grooming had sorted them into the living and the dead with perfect accuracy. He thought about Hoffman, about Richter, about every soldier who had died because a rule seemed arbitrary until poison gas made it prophecy. The survivors understood now. They would shave every morning for the rest of their lives, because they had learned what everyone eventually learned on the Eastern Front, that survival was not heroism or luck or divine favor. It was compliance with regulations written in blood by men who had already watched others die from ignorance of rules that seemed meaningless until the moment they became everything.